"Please save my mommy," the toddler begged. The billionaire was horrified by what his fiancée had done. She thought no one would ever find out what she did in that basement. She thought the little girl was too young to understand, too small to speak up, too scared to tell the truth. She was wrong. Because sometimes the smallest voice in the house carries the loudest truth. And on one ordinary evening, when a 3-year-old girl tugged on a billionaire's sleeve and whispered 4 words, everything he thought he knew about the woman he was about to marry came crashing down in an instant. Nobody in Fairview Heights ever imagined that the grand white mansion on Maple Crest Lane hid a secret darker than anything the neighborhood could gossip about. Daniel Whitmore was 45 years old, and by every outward measure, he had built the kind of life most people only dreamed about. He owned 3 companies, a private jet he rarely used because he preferred driving himself, and a mansion with more rooms than he could count on both hands. But none of that mattered to him nearly as much as the people who worked and lived under his roof. Daniel wasn't the kind of wealthy man who saw his staff as furniture. He knew their names, their birthdays, their kids' names too. One of those people was Angela Brooks, a 38-year-old housekeeper who had been with the Whitmore household for almost 4 years. Angela wasn't just staff to Daniel. She was one of the most trusted people in his life. She managed the house with quiet efficiency, she never complained, and she always had a warm smile even on the hardest days. Angela was a single mother, raising her 3-year-old daughter Maya, mostly on her own after her husband passed away in a car accident 2 years earlier. Daniel had let Angela bring Maya to work with her rather than pay for daycare she couldn't afford, and over time, little Maya had become something like a small ray of sunshine in that big, quiet house. She'd toddle down the halls with her stuffed rabbit, humming little songs, and everyone who saw her couldn't help but smile. Angela worked hard, harder than anyone realized. She was up before sunrise, cooking breakfast, ironing shirts, managing the household schedule, and still finding time to braid Maya's hair before dropping her off at the small in-house playroom Daniel had set up just for her. Angela never asked for anything extra. She was grateful simply to have stable work, a roof for her daughter, and a boss who treated her with basic human respect, something she hadn't always experienced in her years of domestic work. Life had been steady for the Whitmore household. That is, until Daniel introduced someone new into the picture. His fiancée, Victoria Lane. Victoria was 29, stunning, sharp-tongued when she wanted to be, and incredibly good at making people believe exactly what she wanted them to believe. Daniel had met her at a charity gala 18 months earlier. She was charming, attentive, always dressed to perfection, and she seemed genuinely interested in his life, his work, his dreams. Daniel, who had spent years feeling like people only wanted access to his wallet, thought he had finally found someone who wanted him. He proposed after a year together. The ring alone had cost more than most people's homes. Victoria cried tears of joy on the balcony of his penthouse downtown, and for a while, everything felt like the beginning of something beautiful. But there was a version of Victoria that Daniel never saw. A version that only came out when he wasn't home. From the very first week she moved into the mansion, Victoria made it clear, quietly, subtly, that she didn't like how much attention the staff received. She didn't like that Angela ate lunch at the kitchen table instead of standing. She didn't like that Maya's laughter echoed through the hallways. She didn't like feeling, in her own words to a friend on the phone one night, like the help runs this house more than I do. First, it was small things. Victoria would criticize Angela's work in front of guests, even when everything was done perfectly. She'd accidentally leave extra chores for Angela late at night after Daniel had already gone to bed, chores that had nothing to do with the house and everything to do with control. She'd make comments about Maya being too loud or too visible, suggesting more than once that a 3-year-old had no business being anywhere near the living room when guests came over. Angela noticed the shift immediately. She'd worked in enough homes over the years to recognize the signs of someone who saw her as beneath them. But Angela needed this job. She needed the stability for Maya's sake. So she stayed quiet, worked harder, and tried to stay out of Victoria's way as much as possible. Daniel, meanwhile, remained mostly unaware. He traveled often for business, sometimes gone for 4 or 5 days at a stretch, meeting investors in New York, Chicago, sometimes overseas. Victoria made sure that whenever he was home, everything appeared calm, warm, even joyful. She'd cook his favorite meals, ask about his day, laugh at his jokes. She was, in every visible way, the perfect partner. What Daniel didn't know was that the moment his car pulled out of the driveway, something in Victoria would shift. Her voice would change. Her patience would vanish. And Angela would brace herself for what the day might bring. One evening, about 3 weeks before everything changed forever, Angela made an offhand comment to a fellow staff member, the groundskeeper, an older man named Frank who'd worked for the Whitmore family for over a decade. "She looks at me like I'm something she stepped in," Angela said quietly while wiping down the kitchen counters. Frank didn't respond right away. He'd seen this pattern before, in other houses with other families. He simply said, "Be careful, Angela. Some people don't like being reminded that kindness exists." Angela didn't fully understand what he meant that night. She would understand very soon. Because Victoria wasn't just cold. Victoria was calculating. And she had already begun planning something that would test the very limits of what Angela and little Maya could survive. Do you think Angela should have said something to Daniel sooner? Or was she right to stay quiet and protect her job? Let us know what you think in the comments below. The tension in that house was like a storm building slowly on the horizon, and almost nobody could see it coming except the 2 people living closest to it. As the weeks went on, Victoria's behavior toward Angela grew colder, sharper, more deliberate. She began finding reasons to send Angela into far corners of the property. The wine cellar, the old storage room off the garage, the basement level that Daniel rarely used since he'd converted most of it into a home gym he never had time for. Victoria claimed she wanted the house organized properly before the wedding, which was now just 2 months away. Guests would be coming from all over the country, she said. Everything had to be perfect. Angela didn't question it. Organizing before a big event made sense. She spent long hours down in the basement, sorting through old boxes, dusting shelves that hadn't been touched in years, hauling things back and forth under dim lighting. Maya would sometimes come down with her, sitting in the corner with her coloring books while her mother worked, humming softly to herself. Daniel noticed Angela seemed more tired than usual during this period, but when he asked if everything was all right, she simply smiled and said she was fine, just busy with wedding preparations. He believed her, the way people believe the ones they trust without needing proof. Meanwhile, Victoria's true nature was becoming impossible to ignore for anyone paying close attention, except Daniel, who was buried in a massive company acquisition that had him working 16-hour days and traveling almost weekly. He'd come home late, exhausted, and Victoria would be waiting with a glass of wine and a warm dinner, playing the role of devoted partner flawlessly. What Daniel didn't see was how Victoria's resentment toward Angela had begun curdling into something far more dangerous than simple dislike. It had become obsession. Victoria couldn't stand the way Daniel spoke about Angela, always with respect, sometimes even gratitude. She couldn't stand the way Maya's giggles seemed to soften something in him, the way he'd occasionally scoop the little girl up when he passed her in the hallway and ask about her day. Victoria had convinced herself, in the twisted logic of her own insecurity, that Angela and Maya were somehow a threat to the life she was building, that their presence reminded Daniel of a warmth and simplicity that money couldn't buy, a warmth Victoria feared she couldn't compete with. One afternoon, while Daniel was in Denver closing a deal, Victoria called Angela into the kitchen. Her tone was different that day. Sharper, colder, with an edge Angela hadn't heard before. "I need you to check something in the basement," Victoria said. "There's a pipe issue near the old storage room. I need you to look at it before the plumber comes tomorrow." Angela, ever dutiful, nodded and made her way downstairs, leaving Maya upstairs in the playroom with a staff member who occasionally helped watch her. She walked through the dim basement hallway toward the old storage room at the far end. A room with thick concrete walls, originally built as a safe room by the home's previous owners, complete with a heavy door that locked from the outside. The moment Angela stepped inside to check the supposed pipe, she heard the door swing shut behind her. Then came the sound of the lock turning. "Victoria!" Angela called out, confusion quickly turning into alarm. "Victoria, this isn't funny. Open the door." There was no laughter, no explanation, no answer at all. Just silence on the other side of that thick door. Angela pounded on the door for several minutes, her voice growing desperate, but the room had been built decades earlier with soundproofing in mind, a precaution from an era when the world felt less safe and wealthy families worried about home invasions. No sound escaped those walls. No sound got in either. Hours passed. Angela sat on the cold concrete floor, her mind racing through every possible explanation, refusing at first to believe what was becoming increasingly obvious, that this wasn't an accident. This was intentional. Upstairs, Maya kept asking where her mommy went. The staff member watching her assumed Angela was simply finishing up a task and would be back soon. Nobody thought to check the basement. Nobody except one small, worried 3-year-old, who slipped away from the playroom sometime later that evening and wandered the halls searching for her mother. Her little feet padding softly across the marble floors, calling out, "Mommy," into rooms that gave her no answer. Have you ever had a moment where your gut told you something was wrong, but you couldn't prove it yet? Tell us about it in the comments below. And then, everything changed in a single moment. By the time Daniel's flight landed back in the city that evening, exhaustion sat heavy on his shoulders. The deal in Denver had gone well, but a week of back-to-back meetings had drained him completely. All he wanted was a quiet night at home, maybe a glass of scotch, and some peace before diving back into work the next morning. He walked through the front door around 8:30, loosening his tie, calling out a tired greeting. Victoria appeared almost instantly, wrapping her arms around him with practiced warmth, telling him how much she'd missed him, how the house had felt too quiet without him. She guided him toward the living room, already talking about dinner, about wedding seating charts, about anything that would keep his attention on her and nowhere else. But something small and persistent interrupted the moment. Maya appeared in the doorway of the living room, her small face streaked with dried tears, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly against her chest. She'd clearly been crying for a while, and she'd clearly been searching. Her little socks were smudged with dust from crawling around corners of the house. A toddler shouldn't have been exploring alone. "Mr. Daniel," she said, her voice trembling in that particular way small children's voices tremble when they're trying to be brave. "Please save my mommy." Daniel turned, immediately crouching down to her level, his exhaustion forgotten. "Maya, sweetheart, what's wrong? Where's your mom?" "She went downstairs a long time ago and she didn't come back," Maya said, tears spilling over again. "I looked everywhere. I heard her crying behind the big door. He's stuck. Please, please save her." Victoria's face, for just a fraction of a second, flickered, a tightening around the eyes, a stiffening in her posture that she quickly tried to smooth over. "She's probably just finishing up a task, sweetie," Victoria said quickly, forcing a light laugh. "Daniel, don't worry about it. I'm sure Angela's fine. She's been gone since this morning," Maya interrupted, her small voice suddenly firm with the kind of clarity children sometimes have when adults underestimate them. "It's dark outside now. I heard her banging on the door. I heard her crying my name." Something in Daniel's chest went cold. He looked at Victoria, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw something behind her eyes that unsettled him deeply. Not concern, not confusion, but something closer to calculation. "Show me," Daniel said to Maya, standing up abruptly. He moved toward the basement stairs with long, urgent strides, Maya trailing behind him, pointing the way toward the old storage room at the end of the hallway. Victoria followed, still talking, still trying to redirect him, her voice climbing in pitch as her composure began to crack. "Daniel, this is ridiculous. She's a grown woman. I'm sure there's an explanation." He wasn't listening anymore. When he reached the heavy door, he found it locked from the outside, a simple sliding bolt secured firmly in place. His hands shook as he threw it open. What he found on the other side stopped his heart. Angela was slumped against the far wall, her clothes damp with sweat, her lips cracked and dry, her eyes barely opening in the sudden light. She'd been trapped in that windowless room for over 12 hours without food, without water, in a space that had grown suffocatingly warm as the day wore on. She flinched violently at the sound of the door, raising a weak hand to shield her eyes, whispering hoarsely, "Please, no more, I didn't do anything." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. No more. As if this had happened before. As if there had been other moments of cruelty he'd never known about. He rushed to her side, cradling her head, calling her name, while behind him, Victoria stood frozen in the doorway, her carefully constructed mask finally, completely shattering. What would you do if you were in Daniel's place, discovering something like this in your own home? Tell us honestly in the comments. Daniel barely remembered calling 911. He barely remembered carrying Angela up the basement stairs himself, refusing to let go of her even as paramedics arrived at the door 20 minutes later. All he could focus on was the sound of her ragged breathing, the way her body trembled against his arms, and the haunting echo of Maya's small voice repeating over and over, "You saved my mommy. You saved my mommy." The paramedics confirmed what Daniel already feared: severe dehydration, dangerously low blood pressure, and the beginnings of heat exhaustion from being trapped in an enclosed space for so many hours. Angela was rushed to the hospital, and Daniel followed in his own car, Maya buckled tightly into the back seat, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, occasionally whispering reassurances to it as if comforting herself. Back at the mansion, Victoria had tried, in the chaos of the moment, to offer explanations that grew more desperate and less believable with every sentence. She claimed it was a misunderstanding. She claimed Angela must have locked herself in by accident. She claimed she'd simply forgotten Angela was down there at all, an explanation that fell apart instantly given that she'd been the one who sent Angela into that room in the first place, and given the bolt lock could only be secured from the outside. Daniel didn't argue with her that night. He didn't have the energy, and more importantly, he didn't trust himself to speak without saying something he couldn't take back. He simply told her, in a voice quieter and colder than she'd ever heard from him, "We will talk about this. But not tonight." At the hospital, as Angela slowly regained her strength through 4 fluids and rest, she finally found the courage to tell Daniel everything, not just about that day, but about the weeks leading up to it. The constant basement errands. The cold, calculated comments. The subtle campaign of exhausting, demoralizing tasks that Victoria had been assigning her, seemingly designed to push her toward quitting, or perhaps toward something worse. "I didn't want to cause problems," Angela admitted, her voice still weak, tears sliding down her face. "I needed this job. I needed it for Maya. I thought if I just kept my head down, it would get better." Daniel sat beside her hospital bed, his jaw tight, guilt and fury warring inside him in equal measure. Guilt, because he'd been so consumed with work, so wrapped up in the illusion Victoria had built for him, that he'd missed every sign of what was happening under his own roof. Fury, because someone he'd trusted enough to marry had been capable of something this cruel to someone who had done nothing but work hard and raise her daughter with quiet dignity. "You should have told me," Daniel said softly, not as an accusation but as a quiet ache. "Would you have believed me?" Angela asked, and the question hung heavy in the sterile hospital air. "She's very good at seeming perfect." Daniel didn't have an answer for that. Because the honest truth was, he wasn't entirely sure. Victoria had fooled him for 18 months. She'd fooled his friends, his business partners, even his own mother, who'd commented more than once on how lucky Daniel was to have found someone so warm and attentive. That night, sitting in the quiet of the hospital room while Maya slept curled up in the chair beside her mother's bed, Daniel made a decision that would define not just the next few days, but the rest of his life. He wasn't just going to end things with Victoria. He was going to make sure she faced real consequences for what she'd done, not just to protect Angela, but to protect anyone else who might cross paths with someone capable of this kind of calculated cruelty in the future. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. Then he called the police department directly, requesting to file a formal report the moment Angela was strong enough to give her statement. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between staying quiet to protect yourself and speaking up even though it was scary? Share your story with us below. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of quiet, deliberate justice that Daniel made sure was thorough, fair, and complete. Victoria was formally confronted the following afternoon, once Daniel had gathered enough composure to face her without letting rage cloud his judgment. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He simply laid out everything Angela had told him, everything the police report would eventually confirm through the home's security footage from the hallway camera outside the basement door. Footage that clearly showed Victoria leading Angela into the storage room and sliding the bolt lock into place before walking away without a second glance. Victoria's response shifted rapidly from denial to anger to, finally, a kind of cold indifference that told Daniel everything he needed to know about who she truly was beneath the charm. "She's just the help," Victoria finally spat out, when her excuses ran dry. "I don't understand why this is such a big deal to you." Those 7 words ended any lingering doubt Daniel might have had about the decision in front of him. He called off the engagement that same day. Victoria was given 24 hours to remove her belongings from the mansion, escorted the entire time by Daniel's head of security to ensure nothing further happened. And true to the promise he'd made in that hospital room, Daniel followed through on the police report. With the security footage as clear evidence, along with Angela's medical records documenting her condition upon rescue, Victoria was formally charged with unlawful imprisonment and reckless endangerment. The engagement ring, once a symbol of a future Daniel thought he wanted, was left behind on the kitchen counter, a small, glittering reminder of how easily appearances could deceive. Angela, meanwhile, was given all the time she needed to recover, fully paid, with Daniel personally covering every medical expense related to the incident. When she finally returned to the house 2 weeks later, she found something waiting for her that she never expected. Daniel had converted the old basement storage room entirely, tearing out the heavy door and thick walls, transforming it instead into a bright, sunlit playroom for Maya, complete with soft carpets, shelves of books, and large windows that had been added to let in natural light where there had once been none. "I wanted it to be something good," Daniel told her simply, standing in the doorway of the transformed room while Maya ran inside, delighted, immediately claiming a spot by the window. "I wanted this place to never remind either of you of what happened here again." It was a small gesture in some ways, but it meant everything to Angela. A tangible sign that the man she worked for hadn't just apologized with words, but had taken real, thoughtful action to make things right. Over the months that followed, something quietly beautiful began to grow in that household. Daniel found himself spending more time at home, more present, more attentive to the people around him rather than buried entirely in work. He began joining Maya and Angela for dinner some evenings, at first out of guilt, and then simply because he genuinely enjoyed their company. Maya's endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether billionaires could fly, and Angela's quiet wisdom and hard-earned strength that Daniel had come to deeply respect. Nobody would call it a fairy tale ending, not right away. Trust, once broken by one person's cruelty, doesn't rebuild overnight, and Angela carried the memory of that locked door with her for a long time afterward. But healing, Daniel came to understand, isn't about erasing what happened. It's about what you choose to build afterward, brick by brick, moment by moment. One evening, almost a year after that terrifying day, Daniel sat in the newly renovated playroom watching Maya build an elaborate tower out of wooden blocks while Angela read quietly nearby, finally looking rested, finally looking safe. Maya's tower toppled over with a crash, and instead of crying, she burst into giggles, immediately starting to rebuild it from scratch. Daniel watched her, and it struck him. That was exactly what real strength looked like. Not the absence of things falling apart, but the courage to rebuild anyway, without fear, without hesitation, just pure, stubborn hope. The true measure of a person, Daniel realized, isn't found in how they treat those who can benefit them. It's found in how they treat those who can't. Kindness costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything. To everyone watching this story tonight, thank you for staying until the very end. Stories like this remind us that the smallest voices sometimes carry the most important truths, and that real strength isn't about power or money, but about how we choose to protect the people who can't always protect themselves. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours while writing it, please hit that like button. It truly means the world to us and helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel because we share real, emotional stories just like this one every single week. Stories that will make you feel, make you think, and remind you to believe in people again. What part of this story hit you hardest? Was it Maya's courage, Angela's strength, or Daniel's decision to make things right? We read every single comment, so tell us below. And if you know someone who needs a reminder today that speaking up matters, send this video their way. You never know whose life it might touch. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.